There we go. Okay.
Snorlax.
Are you okay, bud?
He's tired.
Okay. We're recording from a different angle because this is more comfortable for everyone. Okay. The Desert of Colors. You want to see the picture?
I want to see. That's not very colorful.
Well, the pictures are in black and white in this book. Never had Bastian slept so soundly as in that glowing red blossom. When at last he opened his eyes, the sky overhead was still a velvety black. He stretched and was happy to feel miraculous strength in his limbs. Once again there had been a change in him. His wish to be strong had come true. When he stood up and looked out over the edge of the great blossom, Parolin seemed to have stopped growing. The night forest looked pretty much the same as when he'd last seen it. He didn't know that this too was connected with the fulfillment of his wish, and that his memory of his weakness and clumsiness had been blotted out at the same time. He was handsome and strong, but somehow that wasn't enough for him. He also felt the need to be tough and inured to hardship like Atreyu. But how was he to come by that quality in this luminous garden, where all manner of fruit was to be had for the picking? The first pearly streaks of dawn appeared over the eastern horizon, and with the rising of the light, the phosphorescence of the night plants paled. "High time," said Bastian aloud. "I thought the day would never come." He sat down on the floor of the blossom and wondered what he should do. Climb down again and keep going? Of course, since he was Lord of Parolin, no one could stop him from wandering around in it for days, if not for months or years. This jungle was so enormous, he would never find his way out of it. But beautiful as he found the night plants, he didn't think this prospect would suit him in the long run. Exploring a desert, that would be something else again. The biggest desert in Fantastica. Yes, that would be something to be proud of.
Parolin, not Fantastica.
Parolin is the forest. He's in Fantastica. That's the land.
Oh.
In that same moment, a violent tremor shook the giant tree. The trunk bent, and a crackling, groaning sound could be heard. Bastian had to hold tight to keep from rolling out of his blossom, the stem of which tilted more and more until at last it lay flat. The sun, which had risen in the meantime, disclosed a vision of devastation. Hardly anything was left of all the enormous night plants. More quickly than they had sprung up, they crumbled under the glaring sunlight into dust and fine-colored sand. Gigantic tree trunks collapsed as sandcastles do when they dry out. Bastian's tree seemed to be the last still standing, but when he tried to steady himself by grasping at the petals of his flower, they crumbled in his hands and blew away like a cloud of dust. Now that there was nothing to obstruct the view, he saw how terrifyingly high up he was. He knew he would have to climb down as fast as possible, for the tree was likely to collapse at any moment.
Oh, so I get this.
Do you?
It turns into a forest at night, but during the day it's a desert.
Cautiously, he climbed out of the blossom and straddled the stem, which was now bent like a fishing pole. No sooner had he left the blossom than it broke off behind him and crumbled into dust and falling. Ever so gingerly, Bastian proceeded downward. Many a man would have panicked on seeing the ground so very far below, but Bastian was free from dizziness and his nerves were steel. Knowing that any abrupt movement might reduce the whole tree to dust, he crept along the bough and finally reached the place where the trunk became vertical. Hugging it, he let himself slide inch by inch. Several times great clouds of colored dust fell on him from above. There were no branches left, and what towering stumps remained crumbled when Bastian tried to use them for support. As he continued downward, the trunk became too big for him to hold, and he was still far above the ground. He stopped to think, how was he ever going to get down? But then another tremor passed through the giant stump and relieved him of the need for further thought. What was left of the tree disintegrated and settled into a great mound of sand. Bastian rolled down the side of it in a wild whirl, turning a number of somersaults on the way, and finally came to rest at the bottom. He came close to being buried under an avalanche of colored dust, but he fought his way clear, spat the sand out of his mouth, and shook it out of his ears and clothes. Wherever he looked, the sand was moving in slow streams and eddies. It collected into hills and dunes of every shape and size, each with a color of its own.
That's why it was a grain of sand during the beginning, because
light blue sand gathered to form a light blue hill, and the same with green and violet, and so on. Parolin, the night forest, was gone, and a desert was taking its place. And what a desert! Bastian had climbed a dune of purplish red sand, and all around him he saw nothing but hill after hill of every imaginable color. Each hill revealed a shade or tint that reoccurred in no other. The nearest was cobalt blue, another was saffron yellow, and then came crimson red, then indigo, apple green, sky blue, orange, peach, mauve, turquoise, blue, lilac, moss green, ruby red, burnt umber, Indian yellow, vermilion, lapis lazuli, and so on, from horizon to horizon. And between the hills, separating color from color, flowed streams of gold and silver sand. "This," said Bastian aloud, "is Gob, the desert of colors." The sun rose higher and higher, and the heat became murderous. The air over the colored sand dunes shimmered, and Bastian realized that he was in a tight spot. He could not stay in this desert, that was certain. If he didn't get out of it soon, he would die of hunger and thirst. He took hold of the childlike empress's emblem in the hope that it would guide him, and then staunchly he started on his way. He climbed dune after dune. Hour after hour he plodded on, never seeing anything but hill after hill. Only the colors kept changing. His fabulous strength was no longer of any use to him, for desert distances cannot be vanquished with strength. The air was a searing blast from hell. His tongue clung to the roof of his mouth, and his face streamed with sweat. The sun was a whirl of fire in the middle of the sky. It had been in the same place for a long time and didn't seem to move. That day in the desert was as long as the night in Parolin. Bastian's eyes burned, and his tongue felt like a piece of leather, but he didn't give up. His body had dried out, and the blood in his veins was so thick it could hardly flow. But he went on, slowly, with even steps, neither hurrying nor stopping to rest, as if he had years of experience at crossing deserts on foot. He ignored the torments of thirst. His will had become as hard as steel. Neither fatigue nor hardship could bend it. He recalled how easily he had been discouraged in the past. He had begun all sorts of projects and given up at the first sign of difficulty. He had always been afraid of not getting enough to eat, or falling ill, or having to endure pain. All that was far behind him. No one before him had dared to cross Gob, the desert of colors, on foot, nor would anyone undertake to do so in the future, and most likely no one would ever hear of his exploit. This last thought saddened Bastian. Gob seemed to be so inconceivably large, he felt sure he would never come to the end of it. Despite his phenomenal endurance, he was bound to perish sooner or later. That didn't frighten him. He would die with calm dignity like the hunters in Atreus' country. But since no one ever ventured into this desert, the news of his death would never be divulged, either in Fantastica or at home. He would simply be reported missing, and no one would ever know he had been in Fantastica or in the Desert of Gob. All Fantastica, he said to himself, was contained in the book that the old man of Wandering Mountain had written. This book was the Neverending story, which he himself had read in the attic. Maybe his present adventures and sufferings were in a book even now, and maybe someone else would read the book someday. Maybe someone was reading it at that very moment. In that case, it must be possible to give that someone a sign. The sandhill where Bastian was standing just then was ultramarine blue, and separated from it by a narrow cleft there was a fiery red dune. Bastian crossed over to it, gathered up sand in both hands, and carried it to the blue hill. Then he strewed a long line of red sand on the hillside. He went back, brought more red sand, and repeated the operation. Soon he had fashioned 3 enormous red letters against the blue ground. B, B, B. He viewed his work with satisfaction. No reader of the Neverending Story could fail to see his message. So whatever happened to him now, someone would know where he had been. He sat down to rest on the red hilltop. The 3 letters glinted bright in the desert sun. Another piece of his memory of the old bastion had been wiped out. He forgot that he had once been the namby-pamby, something of a crybaby, in fact, and he was ever so proud of his toughness, but already a new wish was taking form. "It's true that I fear nothing," he said aloud, "but what I still lack is true courage. Being able to endure hardships is a great thing, but courage and daring are something else again. I wish I could run into a real adventure, something calling for great courage. How grand it would be to meet some dangerous creature. Maybe not as hideous as Igramul, but much more dangerous. A beautiful but very, very dangerous creature. The most dangerous creature in all Fantastica. I'd step right up to it and—" Bastian said no more, for in that same moment he heard a roaring and rumbling so deep that the ground trembled beneath his feet. Bastian turned around. Far in the distance he saw something that looked like a ball of fire. Moving with incredible speed, it described a wide arc around the spot where Bastian was sitting, then came straight toward him. In the shimmering desert air, which made the outline of things waver like flames, the creature looked like a dancing fire demon. Bastian was stricken with terror. Before he knew it, he had run down into the cleft between the red dune and the blue dune. But no sooner had he got there than he felt ashamed and overcame his fear. He took hold of Auron and felt all the courage he had wished for streaming into his heart. Then again he heard the deep roar that made the ground tremble, but this time it was near him. He looked up. A huge lion was standing on the fiery red dune. The sun was directly behind him and made his great mane look like a wreath of fire. This lion was not a tawny color like other lions, but as fiery red as the dune on which he was standing. The beast did not seem to have noticed the boy, so much smaller than himself, who was standing in the cleft between the 2 dunes, but seemed to be looking at the red letters on the opposite hill. The great rumbling voice said, "Who did this?" "I did," said Bastian. "What is it?" "It's my initials," said Bastian. "My name is Bastian Balthazar Bucks." Then, for the first time, the lion turned toward Bastian, who for a moment expected to be burned to a crisp by the flames that seemed to surround the lion. But his fear soon passed, and he returned the lion's gaze. "I," said the huge beast, "am Grograman, Lord of the Desert of Colors. I am also known as the Many-Colored Death." Bastian felt the deadly power that flowed from the lion's eyes, but he did not avert his own. When they had measured their strength for some time, the lion looked down. With slow, majestic movements he descended from the dune. When he stepped onto the ultramarine sand, he too changed color. His coat and mane became blue. For a moment the huge beast stood facing Bastian, who had to look up at him as a mouse might look up at a cat. Then suddenly Grograman lay down and touched his head to the ground. "Master," he said, "I am your servant. I await your commands." "I'd like to get out of this desert," said Bastian. "Can you manage that?" Grograman shook his mane. "No, master, that I cannot do." "Why not?" "Because I carry the desert with me." Not knowing what to make of this, Bastian asked, "Isn't there somebody who can get me out of here?" "How could that be, master?" said Grograman. "Where I am, no other living creature can exist. My presence alone would suffice to reduce everybody, even the most powerful of creatures, into ashes for thousands of miles around. That's why I'm called the Many-Colored Death and Lord of the Desert of Colors." That's not so, said Bastion. Everybody doesn't get burned up in your desert. Look at me. Because you are bearing the gem, Master. Orin protects you, even from me, the deadliest creature in Fantastica. You mean that if I didn't have the gem, I'd be reduced to ashes? That's how it is, Master. That's what would happen, though personally I'd regret it. But you're the first and only being who has ever spoken to me. Bastion touched the amulet. Thank you, Moonchild, he said under his breath. Grogramon stood up to his full height and looked down at Bastion. I believe, Master, that we have things to discuss. Perhaps I can acquaint you with certain secrets, and perhaps you can clear up the riddle of my existence for me. Bastion nodded, but first he said, Could you possibly get me something to drink? I'm very thirsty. Your servant hears and obeys, said Grogramon. Will you deign to sit on my back? I shall carry you to my palace, where you will find everything you need. Bastion climbed up on the lion's back and clutched the flaming mane in both hands. Grogramon looked back at his passenger. Hold on tight, Master. I'm a swift runner. And one more thing. As long as you are in my domain, and especially when you are with me, promise me that you will never, for any reason, lay down the amulet that protects you. I promise, said Bastion. The lion started off, at first at a slow, dignified gait, then faster and faster. To Bastion's amazement, the lion's coat and mane changed color with every new sandhill. But soon Grogramon was making great leaps from hilltop to hilltop, and his coat changed color faster and faster. Bastion's eyes swam, and he saw all the colors at once as in a rainbow. The hot wind whistled around Bastion's ears and tugged at his mantle, which fluttered beneath him. He felt the movements of the lion's muscles and breathed the wild, heady smell of the shaggy mane. The triumphant shout that escaped him resembled the cry of a bird of prey, and Grogramon answered with a roar that made the desert tremble. For the moment, these two different creatures were one. Bastion's heart and mind were in the clouds. He didn't come to himself until he heard Grogramon saying, We have arrived, Master. Will you deign to alight? Bastion jumped down from the lion's back and landed on the sandy ground. Before him he saw a cleft mountain of black rock. Or was it a ruined building? He didn't know, for the stones which made up the door frames, walls, columns, and terraces of the building, as well as those that were lying about half buried in colored sand, were deeply creviced and smooth, as though the sandstorms of time had smoothed away all sharp edges and roughness. This, Master, is my palace and my tomb, Bastion heard the lion's voice saying. You are Grogramon's first and only guest. Enter and make yourself at home. The sun hung low over the horizon, a great pale yellow disk, shorn of its searing heat. Apparently the ride had taken much longer than it had seemed to Bastion. The truncated columns or spurs of rock, whichever they might be, cast long shadows. It would soon be night. As Bastion followed the lion through a dark doorway leading into the palace, he had the impression that Grogramon's steps sounded tired and heavy. After passing a dark corridor and up and down a number of stairways, they came at last to a large double door which seemed to be made of black rock. As Grogramon approached, it opened of its own accord, and when they'd both gone through, it closed behind them. Now they were in a large hall, or rather a cave, lit by hundreds of lamps whose flames resembled the play of colors on Grogramon's coat. The floor was of colored tiles. At the center was a circular platform surrounded by steps, and on the platform lay an enormous black rock. Grogramon seemed spent as he turned to Bastion. My time is close at hand, Master, he said, hardly above a whisper. There won't be time for our talk. But don't worry and wait for the day. What has always happened will happen once again. And perhaps you will be able to tell me why. Then he pointed his head in the direction of a little gate at the other end of the cave. "Go in there, master. You will find everything in readiness. That room has been waiting for you since the beginning of time." Bastian went to the gate, but before opening it he glanced back. Grogramon had sat down on the black rock. He was as black as the stone. In a faint, far-off voice he said, "Quite possibly, master, you will hear sounds that will frighten you. Don't be afraid. As long as you carry the emblem, nothing can happen to you." Bastian nodded and passed through the gate. The room he entered was magnificent. The floor was laid with soft, richly colored carpets. The graceful columns supporting the vaulted ceiling were covered with gold mosaic, which fragmented the vari-colored light of the lamps. In one corner, Bastian saw a broad divan covered with soft rugs and cushions of all kinds, surmounted by a canopy of azure blue silk. In the opposite corner, the stone floor had been hollowed to form a pool filled with golden liquid. On a low table stood bowls and dishes of food, a carafe full of some ruby-red drink, and a golden cup. Bastian squatted down at the table and fell to. The drink had a tart, wild taste and was wonderfully thirst-quenching. The dishes were unknown to Bastian. Some looked like cakes or nuts, others like squash or melons, but the taste was entirely different, sharp and spicy. Everything was delicious, and Bastian ate his fill. Then he took his clothes off, but not the amulet, and stepped into the pool. For a while he splashed about, washed himself, dived under, and came up puffing like a walrus. Then he discovered some strange-looking bottles at the edge of the pool. Thinking they must be bath oils, he poured a little of each into the water. Green, red, and yellow flames darted hissing over the surface, and a little smoke went up. It smelled of resin and bitter herbs, and then the flames died. After a while, Bastian got out of the water, dried himself with the soft towels that lay ready, and put his clothes on. Suddenly he noticed that the lamps were not burning as brightly as before. And then he heard a sound that sent the cold shivers down his spine, a cracking and grinding, as though a rock were bursting under the pressure of expanding ice. Bastian's heart pounded. He remembered that Grogramon had told him not to be afraid. The sound softened to a moan and soon stopped. It was not repeated, but the stillness was almost more terrible. Determined to find out what had happened, Bastian opened the door of the bedchamber. At first he saw no change in the great hall, except that the lamplight now seemed somber and was pulsating like a faltering heartbeat. The lion was still sitting in the same attitude on the black rock. He seemed to be looking at Bastian. "Grogramon!" Bastian cried. "What's going on? What was that sound? Was it you?" The lion made no answer and didn't move. When Bastian approached him, the lion followed him with his eyes. Hesitantly, Bastian stretched out his hand to stroke the lion's mane, but the moment he touched it, he recoiled in horror. It was hard and ice-cold like the black rock, and Grogramon's face and paws felt the same way. Bastian didn't know what to do. He saw that the black stone doors were slowly opening. He left the hall, but it wasn't until he had passed through the long, dark corridor and was on his way up the stairs that he started wondering what he would do when he was outside. In this desert, there couldn't be anyone capable of saving Grogramon. But it wasn't a desert anymore. Whichever way Bastian looked, he saw glittering dots. Millions of tiny plants were sprouting from the grains of sand which had become seeds again. Perilin, the night forest, was growing once more. Bastian sensed that Grogramon's rigidity was somehow connected with this transformation. He went back to the cave. The light in the lamps was barely flickering. He went over to the lion, threw his arms around the huge neck, and pressed his face to the beast's face. The lion's eyes were black and as dead as the rock. Grogramon had turned to stone. The lights flared for an instant and went out, leaving the cave in total darkness. Bastian wept bitterly. The stone lion was wet with his tears. In the end, The boy curled up between the great paws and fell asleep.
Oh, it's gonna be hard to stop that. 'Cause it's so